Hey guys, tonight we step quietly through the heavy wooden doorway of a Viking Longhouse somewhere along the cold northern coast, where the wind smells like salt smoke and distant pine forests. The evening sky outside is fading into a soft grey blue, and inside the building a long ribbon of firelight stretches across the centre of the room like a glowing path. The fire crackles, shadows move along timber walls. Somewhere nearby a goat snorts in its sleep. You take one step inside and immediately notice the smoke. Not choking, not exactly unbearable, but definitely present. It curls slowly upward from the central hearth before drifting through gaps in the roof. Vikings didn't build chimneys the way later houses did. Instead, the smoke simply escaped through small roof vents or open slats, which means the air inside always carries that faint smell of burning wood. You might already be realising something important. Sleeping here tonight is going to be an experience. The longhouse stretches far into the dim light, longer than you expected. Maybe 30 metres from one end to the other, about the length of a basketball court. Thick wooden posts hold up the roof beams, and along both sides of the hall you can see raised wooden platforms layered with furs, blankets and woolen bedding. That's where people sleep. All of them. Families, children, elderly relatives, hired workers, and the occasional traveller who shows up needing a roof for the night. Privacy is not really part of the design philosophy here. You shuffle further inside, letting your eyes adjust to the glow of the fire. A few people sit near the hearth, stirring a large iron pot that smells strongly of onions and fish. Someone is mending a wool tunic. Two children are whispering and giggling until an older woman gives them a look that clearly means bedtime is approaching. If you are hoping for a quiet Scandinavian cabin retreat, this may not quite match the fantasy. Still, the warmth of the fire spreads through the room, pushing back the evening cold. That's one thing Vikings understood very well. If you live in northern Europe where winter nights can stretch for 16 hours, you build your home around heat. Archaeologists have actually uncovered the remains of hundreds of Viking longhouses across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Many date back to around the 8th through 11th centuries, the height of what we now call the Viking Age. Their design stayed surprisingly consistent for centuries. Long rectangular halls made of timber frames, turf walls and thick thatched roofs. They weren't just houses, they were the entire centre of daily life. You pause near the fire as someone hands you a wooden cup filled with something warm and slightly sour, probably ale or lightly fermented barley drink. Vikings drank small amounts of alcohol regularly because fermented liquids were often safer than untreated water. You take a careful sip. It's not terrible. A little smoky, maybe slightly tangy, but after a long day travelling through wind and cold, it feels comforting enough. Now you start noticing the details of the building itself. The roof slopes steeply overhead, layered with thick bundles of straw and turf that help insulate against winter winds. The walls are surprisingly thick too, sometimes built with wooden planks and packed earth. Outside, the building might look simple, but inside it's carefully engineered to hold warmth as long as possible. Historians still argue whether some of the earliest Viking longhouses were partly inspired by earlier Germanic hall designs, or whether the style evolved gradually from farming structures. Either way, by the time Norse settlers reached places like Iceland and Greenland, the longhouse had become the standard blueprint for survival in harsh climates. You walk slowly along one side of the hall where the sleeping platforms sit. They're not individual beds, more like long wooden benches covered with sheepskins and blankets. Each family tends to occupy a section, but the boundaries are flexible. If guests arrive, people shift around. Tonight, apparently, that includes you. A man with a thick beard gestures toward an open space between two bundles of bedding. The unspoken message is clear. Congratulations, that's your spot. You sit down carefully. The platform creaks, but the furs are surprisingly soft. Sheep wool, deer hide, maybe even a bear skin layered underneath. Comfortable enough, if you ignore the fact that you'll be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with strangers. A child nearby studies you with open curiosity, like you might be some exotic animal that wandered in from the forest, which, to be fair, you kind of are. The fire pops loudly, sending a quick spray of sparks upward. Everyone barely reacts. Living around an open flame inside a wooden building might sound terrifying to modern instincts, but Vikings managed this risk carefully. The hearth sat in a shallow pit lined with stone, and someone almost always kept watch while the fire burned. Fire meant survival. Without it, the cold northern nights could be brutal. Somewhere near the doorway, The wind pushes against the wooden boards and produces a low humming sound. The longhouse creaks slightly but holds firm. These buildings were built to last through storms, snow and long winters. You stretch your legs and feel the warmth radiating from the hearth, even from several meters away. Not bad. But then something else drifts through the air. A smell you didn't quite notice at first. Animals. Because here's the quirky detail most people don't expect. In many Viking farms, especially during winter, livestock were brought inside the longhouse or into an attached section of the building. Goats, sheep, sometimes even cows might shelter nearby to stay warm, which means tonight you may be sharing sleeping quarters with a goat named something like Bjorn. Historians still debate exactly how common this practice was across different Viking settlements, but archaeological evidence from farm sites suggests animals were often kept very close to human living spaces. Efficient? Yes. Fragrant? Also, yes. Across the room, someone tosses another log onto the fire. The flames flare brighter for a moment, painting the wooden beams in golden light. Conversations soften. Children settle under blankets. The longhouse slowly begins shifting into its nighttime rhythm, and as you sit there listening to the steady crackle of the hearth and the occasional sleepy bleat of a nearby goat, you realise something comforting. This hall may be smoky, crowded and slightly animal-scented, but for people living 1,000 years ago in the Viking world, this warm wooden building was the safest, cosiest place they knew. You pull a fur blanket closer and lean back against the wall. It's going to be a long night, but at least you're inside, and with a little luck, you might actually survive it. You lie back for a moment on the fur-covered platform, watching the smoke drift lazily toward the roof while the fire crackles below. Now that your eyes have adjusted to the dim orange glow, the shape of the longhouse becomes much clearer. It really is long. Not just slightly stretched, properly impressively long. If you stood at one end and tossed a wooden spoon toward the other side, it might take a respectable amount of effort to reach it. Viking longhouses commonly ranged anywhere from 20 to nearly 50 metres in length depending on the wealth of the household. The wealthier the farmer or chieftain, the larger the hall, and everything inside it follows that long, narrow shape. You notice how the central hearth runs like a glowing spine down the middle of the building. Instead of a single fireplace, the fire stretches in a line, several metres long in some halls, so that heat spreads evenly along the structure. The fire pit is carefully bordered with stones to keep it from wandering too far into the wooden floor. It's simple engineering but clever. Warmth radiates outward to both sides where people sit, work and sleep. Above the hearth, the roof opens slightly along a narrow slit. That's where most of the smoke escapes, though clearly not all of it. The smoke rises slowly before slipping through gaps between wooden planks and thatch. You might notice your eyes watering just a little. Don't worry, that's normal here. Interestingly, archaeologists studying Viking longhouses have discovered that the smoke-filled interior may have actually helped preserve the wooden structure and roof materials. The smoke acted like a natural insect repellent, keeping pests away from the thatch and beams. So while your lungs might complain slightly, the building itself appreciates the arrangement. You sit up and take a closer look at the massive wooden posts running down the length of the hall. These thick pillars support the roof and divide the space into 3 rough sections: the central aisle with the fire, and 2 slightly raised side areas where daily life happens. Those side platforms serve many purposes: sleeping areas, work benches, storage spaces, even places to sit and tell stories after dinner. In fact, the entire longhouse functions less like separate rooms and more like a single giant living space, where everything happens within view of everyone else. Privacy, again, is not really a concept here. But the layout does make sense when you think about it. The Viking world was built around community survival. Families, servants, farm workers, and sometimes slaves, known historically as thralls, often lived together under one roof. A longhouse could hold anywhere from a dozen to 30 or more people depending on the farm's size, and sometimes even more during gatherings or feasts. You glance toward the far end of the building where the light fades into shadow. That area looks slightly different. The benches are thicker, the wood carvings a bit more decorative. That's probably the high seat area. In many Viking halls, the chieftain or household leader sat in a special place called the high seat, positioned along the wall with a clear view of the entire hall. It wasn't just comfortable seating, it symbolised authority. From that spot, a leader could oversee meals, meetings, disputes, and celebrations. Historians still argue whether the high seat also held religious significance connected to Norse gods like Odin, since some saga texts suggest sacred objects were sometimes kept nearby. The exact meaning likely varied between households, but one thing is clear: everyone knew where the boss sat. You hear laughter near the fire as someone stirs the large cooking pot again. The smell drifting through the room is now richer: onions, herbs, maybe bits of dried fish softening in hot broth. Dinner preparations seem to be underway. Before you wander closer to investigate, your eyes drift upward again toward the roof beams. The construction is surprisingly sturdy. Viking builders used curved wooden frames that almost resemble an upside-down ship hull. That design wasn't accidental. Many Viking shipbuilders and house builders share the same woodworking traditions, using flexible timber frames to create strong structures that could handle wind and snow. In fact, some historians believe the same carpentry knowledge used to build famous Viking ships also influenced how longhouses were shaped. The Vikings were, after all, master woodworkers. They didn't rely on nails the way modern builders do. Instead, they used clever joinery techniques: wooden pegs, interlocking beams, and carefully fitted planks. These joints allowed the building to flex slightly during storms without collapsing, which is comforting information to remember when winter winds start howling outside. You run your hand along the wooden bench beside you and feel the texture of years of use. Scratches, grooves, burn marks from dropped embers, each one a small piece of household history. This hall may have stood here for decades already. Generations could have lived here, growing up beside this same fire. A child learning to walk, a traveller telling stories of distant lands, someone carving a wooden spoon late at night while everyone else slept. Longhouses were not temporary shelters. They were the centre of Viking family life. Of course, they weren't identical everywhere. In places like Iceland, where timber was scarce, settlers sometimes built longhouses using turf blocks stacked into thick insulating walls. These turf houses could blend into the landscape like grassy hills. If you accidentally wandered too far away, you might mistake someone's house for a small mound in the earth. Quirky detail. Archaeologists excavating Viking turf houses have occasionally discovered entire sections of preserved walls still intact beneath the soil centuries later. The turf acted like a natural time capsule. You shift slightly on your sleeping spot and glance toward the entrance again. The heavy door remains closed, but you can hear the wind whispering outside. The building shields you well from it. That thick roof and those sturdy beams hold the warmth inside like a protective shell, and slowly you begin to realise something. This longhouse isn't just a shelter, it's more like a wooden world of its own. Inside these walls, people cook, argue, sleep, work, tell stories, raise children, welcome travellers, and wait out long winters. Days and nights pass around the same fire again and again. For the people who live here, the outside world of icy seas and dark forests feels very far away once the door is shut. Someone adds another log to the hearth, and the flames stretch brighter along the centre of the hall. The shadows dance higher on the beams, and the longhouse settles deeper into the quiet rhythm of evening life. You're beginning to understand how this place works, but the night is still young, and the hearth, this glowing centre of everything, is about to become much more important than you realised. You slowly slide closer to the hearth, mostly because the warmth there is irresistible. The deeper evening grows outside, the more everyone in the longhouse seems to drift toward the fire like quiet planets, orbiting a glowing sun. And honestly, you understand why. The hearth is everything here. It warms the hall, cooks the food, dries damp clothing, lights the room, and becomes the social centre of the entire household. Without it, this long wooden building would quickly turn into a very cold barn. You settle down near the edge of the stone-lined fire pit and stretch your hands toward the heat. Sparks rise gently into the smoky air, swirling upward before disappearing through the roof vent. Someone nearby adjusts a thick iron hook hanging over the flames. From that hook dangles a heavy cooking pot, darkened from years of soot and fire. Inside, dinner quietly bubbles. You lean slightly closer, catching the smell of onions, herbs, and something distinctly fishy. Vikings relied heavily on fish in their diet, especially in coastal settlements. Cod, herring, and salmon were common staples, often dried or salted so they could last through long winters. One historical fact archaeologists know for certain: Viking communities were experts at food preservation. Drying racks, smoking huts, and salting methods allowed them to store food for months at a time. which makes sense when you live in a place where winter can stretch endlessly. Someone ladles a small wooden bowl of stew and hands it your way. The broth is thick, hearty, and pleasantly warm. There are bits of barley floating inside, along with chopped root vegetables and soft fish flakes. It's simple food, but after standing near the cold doorway earlier, it tastes incredible. You watch as the cook tosses a handful of herbs into the pot, likely dill or wild garlic. Herbs were commonly used to flavour meals, and Vikings gathered many plants from forests and fields for cooking and medicine. A small bundle of something hangs from a beam above the hearth. At first glance, it looks like dried plants, but when you lean closer, you realise it's actually strips of fish and meat slowly smoking in the warm air above the fire. The smoke rises constantly, gently preserving the food over time, efficient and practical. Also slightly smoky for your eyes. You blink a little as another curl of smoke drifts past your face. People living in longhouses were probably far more accustomed to this environment than modern visitors would be. In fact, historians studying Viking skeletons have sometimes found evidence suggesting many people suffered from respiratory irritation after years of breathing indoor smoke. Historians still argue whether longhouse smoke levels were constantly thick or only noticeable at certain times of day when fires burned strongest. The truth likely depended on ventilation, weather, and the size of the hall, but one thing is certain: nobody here is complaining. You glance along the fire again and notice several small flat stones placed near the edge of the flames. At first they seem random, but then someone carefully sets a piece of dough directly on one of the heated stones. Bread. Flatbread, to be exact. Within minutes, the dough begins to puff slightly and brown. Viking bread was often made from barley, rye, or oats rather than wheat, since wheat struggled to grow in colder northern climates. The result is dense, hearty bread that pairs nicely with stew. Someone flips the flatbread with a wooden stick, and the smell of toasted grain fills the air. You suddenly realise how hungry you actually are. Around the hearth, people sit in loose circles, talking quietly as they eat. Conversations drift across the fire like gentle waves. You hear someone mention a trading voyage. Another person discusses repairing a fishing net. A pair of older men debate whether the coming winter will be harsh. Life here feels strangely calm, which might surprise anyone who imagines Vikings as constant warriors charging across seas with axes raised. While raids and battles certainly happened, the majority of Viking life was farming, fishing, building, and surviving everyday routines. The dramatic stories we hear today only represent a small portion of their lives. You chew slowly on a piece of fresh flatbread, enjoying the warmth of the fire. Then something soft bumps against your leg. You glance down. A goat has wandered over. Apparently it has decided that you are now part of the furniture. The animal sniffs curiously at your boot before settling down beside the fire with a contented sigh. Sharing space with livestock might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but animals played a crucial role in Viking households. They provided milk, wool, meat, and even warmth during winter months. Plus, goats are surprisingly good at minding their own business, most of the time. Across the hearth, a young boy tosses a tiny stick into the flames just to watch it crackle. An older woman gently nudges him away from the edge before he gets too close. Fire safety existed, even if the concept wasn't written down in a handbook. Another quirky detail historians sometimes mention is that Viking households often kept embers alive overnight, rather than relighting fires each morning. Starting a new fire from scratch could be time-consuming, especially in damp conditions. So the hearth rarely went completely cold. Someone always tended it. You stretch your legs again, feeling the steady warmth spreading through the room. Outside, the wind has picked up slightly, rattling the wooden door. Inside, though, the hall remains peaceful. The flames glow softly, painting the timber beams in warm light. Smoke drifts lazily upward. People finish their bowls of stew and settle into relaxed conversation. The hearth hums with quiet life, and you begin to understand something important. This fire is more than just heat. It's the beating heart of the longhouse itself. Everything here, food, warmth, light, stories, comfort, flows outward from these flames, which means when the time finally comes to sleep tonight, the fire will still be glowing gently beside you, and that soft crackle might just become the most soothing sound in the entire Viking world. The stew bowls slowly empty, and the longhouse begins its gradual transformation from dinner hall into sleeping quarters. No one makes a dramatic announcement. There's no bell ringing or formal bedtime signal. Instead, the change happens quietly, almost like the tide coming in. People simply start shifting toward the sleeping platforms. You follow their lead, carrying the lingering warmth of the hearth with you as you climb back onto the wooden bench where your temporary bedding waits. The furs are still warm from earlier, which feels like a small luxury in a world without heated mattresses or electric blankets. You glance down the length of the platform. It's not a row of separate beds. It's more like one long communal sleeping area, divided loosely by blankets, bags, and piles of clothing that mark where one person's space ends and another begins. You might get about the width of your shoulders. Maybe. Viking longhouses were famously communal places. A single household might include the core family, extended relatives, hired farmhands, and sometimes enslaved workers known historically as thralls. Everyone shared the same hall, which means sleeping arrangements were flexible. You pull a sheepskin closer and stretch your legs carefully, trying not to bump the person already settling beside you. They nod politely, clearly used to the nightly routine of squeezing into place like pieces of a wooden puzzle. Across the hall, a mother gently tucks two small children under a thick wool blanket. One of them whispers something that causes quiet giggling, quickly shushed before it spreads. The fire crackles softly in the centre of the room. Its light flickers across the rafters, painting slow moving shadows across the beams above. Even as people settle down, the hearth remains alive, glowing steadily. That's intentional. Many Viking households kept the fire burning through the night, both for warmth and safety. If the fire went out completely during winter, relighting it could take time, and the cold might creep into the hall before morning. So someone usually stayed semi-awake nearby, occasionally adjusting logs or stirring embers, a kind of unofficial night watch. You lie back and stare upward toward the dark ceiling beams. The smoke drifting above has thinned slightly now that cooking is finished, but it still leaves a faint hazy layer near the roof. Interestingly, archaeologists studying Viking houses have found that sleeping platforms were often slightly raised not just for comfort, but to keep people away from the cold floor and closer to the warmer air circulating above the hearth. A clever piece of practical design. You shift your blanket again and feel the soft texture of layered wool beneath your head. Viking bedding might not look fancy, but wool and fur are surprisingly effective at holding warmth. Some of these blankets may even be filled with feathers, which in this environment feels almost luxurious. A quiet murmur spreads through the hall as conversations fade into softer tones. A few people near the hearth continue talking, low voices discussing tomorrow's work on the farm. Fishing nets need repairing. A fence must be fixed before winter storms arrive. Maybe someone will travel to a nearby settlement next week. Life here moves steadily with the seasons. There are no glowing screens, no buzzing alarms, no artificial lights keeping people awake late into the night. Once darkness settles outside, the longhouse gradually winds down. Sleep comes earlier in this world. You notice someone hanging a lantern near the far wall, its dim flame barely brighter than a candle. Oil lamps made from carved stone or metal were sometimes used for extra light, often burning animal fat or fish oil. The smell is noticeable, but after a few minutes you hardly think about it. Historians still argue whether Viking households followed strict sleeping schedules or simply rested when darkness made work difficult. In northern regions, where winter nights lasted extremely long, people may have slept in segments, waking briefly before drifting back to sleep again. Your body slowly begins to relax as the quiet deepens. Somewhere nearby, the goat from earlier shifts position and lets out a sleepy little bleat before settling again. You try not to laugh. Yes, you're officially sharing a bedroom with livestock. Another quirky detail researchers have uncovered. In some longhouses, animals stayed in a slightly sunken section near one end of the hall, separated just enough to keep them contained while still benefiting from the shared warmth. Efficient farming meets indoor heating. You pull the fur blanket higher around your shoulders. The longhouse creaks gently as the wind presses against its walls outside, but the thick timber beams barely move. The structure holds firm, like a ship anchored against a storm, and in a way, that's exactly what this building is. A wooden vessel carrying everyone safely through the long northern night. The fire pops softly again, sending a brief spray of sparks into the air. Someone near the hearth stirs the embers with a long stick, making sure the flames stay controlled. You watch the glow flicker across the room. Sleeping shapes line the benches now, people wrapped in blankets, breathing slowly, settling deeper into rest. The quiet becomes heavier, softer. Even the children have finally stopped whispering. You turn slightly on your side, finding a comfortable position against the wall. The warmth from the hearth still reaches this far, though gentler now, like a distant campfire glow. Your eyelids grow heavier, and just as you start drifting towards sleep, you realise something interesting. Despite the crowd, the animals, the smoke, and the lack of personal space, the longhouse feels strangely peaceful. Outside lies cold wind, dark forests, and a vast northern world full of uncertainty. But inside these timber walls, beside the steady glow of the hearth, the Viking household rests together under one roof. And tonight, somehow, you're part of it too. Morning doesn't arrive here with an alarm clock. It arrives with a goat. More specifically, the same goat that decided last night you were acceptable furniture now decides that sunrise is an excellent time to stretch its legs directly beside your sleeping spot. You wake slowly to the sound of hooves shifting on wood and the quiet murmur of people already beginning their day. The fire in the centre of the hall has softened overnight into a glowing bed of embers. Someone crouches beside it, gently blowing air into the coals. Within moments, thin flames begin licking at a new bundle of kindling. The hearth is alive again. Outside the doorway, faint grey light is creeping into the sky. Viking households often woke with the natural rhythm of daylight, especially during summer months when northern mornings arrived early. You rub your eyes and sit up carefully, trying not to disturb the sleepers who are still cocooned in blankets nearby. But many people are already awake. A man near the entrance pulls on a thick wool tunic while stretching his shoulders. Two women near the hearth are quietly grinding grain using a flat stone and a rounded handstone, the steady scraping sound echoing softly through the hall. Breakfast preparations apparently have begun. Daily chores in a Viking household started early, often before the sun fully cleared the horizon. Farming communities relied heavily on daylight hours, especially during short northern growing seasons. Every hour mattered. You swing your legs off the platform and step carefully onto the wooden floor, which is cool beneath your feet but not freezing thanks to the lingering warmth of the hearth. The goat watches you curiously. At this point, you're fairly certain it recognises you. Someone pushes the door open slightly, letting in a rush of cold morning air. The contrast between the warm interior and the crisp outside breeze wakes you up instantly. Beyond the doorway, you catch a glimpse of pale morning sky stretching over grassy fields. A few wooden outbuildings sit nearby. Barns, storage sheds, maybe a small workshop. Viking farms were often clusters of structures surrounding the main longhouse, each building serving a specific purpose. But the longhouse remained the central hub where everyone gathered, worked, and slept. You notice one of the men lifting a bundle of tools from the wall. Wooden handles, iron blades, a small hand axe. Axes were among the most common tools in Viking life. While popular imagination tends to picture them only as weapons, most axes were actually everyday woodworking tools used for building houses, boats, fences, and furniture. In fact, archaeologists have discovered dozens of different Viking axe designs, each suited for a specific task. The tool being carried now looks much more like a carpenter's instrument than a battlefield weapon. Nearby, the grain grinding continues. The women working the stone quern rotate it steadily, turning dried barley into coarse flour. It's patient work, slow, repetitive, and essential. Bread was a staple food in Viking households, and someone needed to grind grain nearly every day. You lean closer to watch. One woman smiles briefly and offers you a turn at the stone. You try rotating it. After about 20 seconds, you realise this job requires far more arm strength than expected. She politely takes the handle back before you accidentally fling barley across the floor. Another quirky historical tidbit. Archaeologists studying Viking skeletons have sometimes found that women's shoulder joints show wear patterns consistent with years of grain grinding. It was physically demanding labour done day after day. Life here builds strong arms. Across the hall, a child helps feed small sticks into the revived hearth fire, while an older man sharpens a knife using a whetstone. The rhythmic scraping sound blends with the quiet morning chatter. The hall feels different now. Nighttime softness has given way to quiet productivity. Historians still argue about how strictly Viking households divided labour between men and women, but evidence from settlements suggests most families shared responsibilities depending on season and need. Fishing, farming, weaving, cooking, building. It all required cooperation, and everyone learned early. You notice a teenage boy carrying a wooden bucket toward the door. He gestures for another child to follow, likely heading to fetch water from a nearby stream or well. Water had to be collected daily. No taps, no plumbing, just buckets, patience, and cold mornings. As they step outside, a shaft of golden sunlight briefly spills into the hall. The fire glows brighter in response, illuminating floating strands of smoke near the roof. Someone hangs a small iron kettle over the flames. Inside it, water begins heating for morning porridge. Porridge, made from oats or barley, was a very common breakfast in Viking households. Simple, filling, and warm enough to start a long day of work. You wander back toward your sleeping spot while the hall gradually fills with movement. Blankets are folded, tools gathered, boots pulled on. The Longhouse is waking up, and in this early morning light, you can see just how busy life here really is. This isn't a place built for lounging beside the fire all day. It's a working household. Fields need tending. Animals must be fed, boats repaired, clothes woven, food prepared. Every person inside this hall plays a role in keeping the small community alive. You stretch your shoulders and glance toward the door again. Outside, the day is beginning. Inside, the Longhouse hums with quiet determination. And somewhere behind you, the goat lets out another thoughtful bleat, almost as if reminding you that Viking mornings start early, whether you're ready or not. The smell of warm porridge slowly fills the Longhouse, drifting outward from the hearth like a soft invitation. After the quiet scramble of the early chores, people begin gathering closer to the fire again, bowls in hand, ready for breakfast. You find yourself sitting near the edge of the hearth beside a wooden bucket of water that someone recently hauled in from outside. The cold air still clings to the surface of the bucket, forming tiny droplets that bead along the rim. The kettle hanging over the fire rattles gently as it begins to boil. Soon a woman carefully lifts it using a hooked iron rod and pours steaming water into a wide cooking pot already filled with crushed barley and oats. The mixture thickens slowly as it cooks, stirred with a long wooden spoon that looks like it has survived years of breakfasts. Porridge may not sound exciting, but here it's the perfect fuel. Warm, filling, and dependable. You watch as bowls are passed around the circle. Someone drops a small pat of butter into the centre of the pot, letting it melt into golden swirls through the grain. That tiny luxury probably comes from milk collected earlier from the goats or cows nearby. Dairy was surprisingly important in Viking diets. Milk, butter, cheese, and a fermented product called skaya, something between yogurt and soft cheese, were common foods in Norse households. Historians know this from both archaeological evidence and written sources like Icelandic sagas, which occasionally mention dairy foods served during meals. You accept a wooden bowl when it reaches you. The porridge is thick and steaming. You blow gently on the surface before taking a careful spoonful. It's hearty, slightly nutty from the barley, and surprisingly comforting. Someone nearby adds a drizzle of honey to their bowl, which you immediately realise is a brilliant idea. Honey was one of the few natural sweeteners available in Viking kitchens. Bees were sometimes kept for honey production, though gathering wild honey from forest hives was also common. And of course, honey had another very important use: mead. But that's a drink usually reserved for feasts and celebrations rather than sleepy mornings like this one. As breakfast continues, another pot is placed near the fire, this one containing leftover stew from last night. Nothing goes to waste in a Viking household. Leftovers are simply reheated and stretched into the next meal. Efficiency keeps everyone fed. You glance upward and notice rows of food hanging from beams above the hearth. Bundles of dried herbs, strings of onions, thin strips of fish slowly curing in the smoky air. This upper space acts like a natural pantry. The warm rising smoke helps preserve food while keeping insects away. Viking kitchens were remarkably clever in using every part of the building's environment. One quirky detail archaeologists have discovered is that some Viking households stored butter underground in cool pits to keep it from spoiling. In rare cases, preserved bog butter has been found centuries later, still sealed inside wooden containers buried in peat. Whether anyone would actually want to taste thousand-year-old butter is another question entirely. Across the hearth, two children share a bowl while arguing softly about who gets the bigger portion. An older woman resolves the dispute with a calm glance that suggests she has handled many such debates. You finish your porridge and place the empty bowl beside the hearthstones. Almost immediately someone rinses it with warm water and sets it aside to dry. Even dishwashing here happens close to the fire. Cooking tools are simple but practical. Iron kettles, wooden spoons, stone grinding tools, flat stones for baking bread. Most Viking cooking relied on boiling, roasting or baking near the hearth. Large ovens were uncommon in typical farmhouses, though small clay baking chambers sometimes existed. You watch as someone begins preparing the next batch of flatbread dough, using the freshly ground flour from earlier. Flour, water, a pinch of salt. The dough is kneaded quickly and shaped into thin rounds before being placed on hot stones beside the flames. Within minutes the bread begins to brown again, filling the hall with that familiar toasted grain smell. Breakfast transitions naturally into preparation for the rest of the day's meals. Historians still argue about how many meals Vikings typically ate in a day. Some evidence suggests 2 main meals were common, a morning meal called dagverda and an evening meal known as natverda. But in busy farm households, small snacks or shared food likely happened whenever people needed energy for work. Outside the door you hear the faint sounds of animals being led out into the fields, goats bleating, chickens scratching. The farm is fully awake now. Someone near the doorway straps on a cloak before stepping into the cool air, likely heading toward fishing boats or pasture land. Inside, the longhouse continues buzzing quietly with activity. A woman begins spinning wool using a spindle, the fibres twisting into thread with practiced ease. Another person gathers dried herbs from the beam to prepare a simple medicinal tea. Every movement feels purposeful, nothing wasted, nothing rushed, and through it all the hearth continues burning steadily in the centre of the hall. The fire warms breakfast, the smoke preserves food, the light guides morning work. Without the hearth, none of this rhythm would exist. You lean back slightly and watch the flames dance again. Outside lies a wide Viking world of farms, forests and cold seas. But inside this longhouse kitchen, life revolves around simple food, shared work, and the quiet comfort of warmth. And for the moment, a bowl of porridge and a piece of warm bread feel like everything you need. Breakfast slowly winds down, but the longhouse doesn't grow quiet again. Instead, it shifts gears. The bowls are stacked, the last crumbs of flatbread disappear, and people begin moving toward the doorway in small groups. Outside, the farm is waiting. You wander toward the open door, curious to see what morning life looks like beyond the wooden walls. As you step outside, a cool breeze brushes your face, carrying the smell of damp grass and sea air. The landscape stretches gently around the farm. Low rolling fields, a few scattered trees. Beyond them, distant hills fading into pale morning mist. But your peaceful moment lasts about 3 seconds, because the animals are here. A cluster of goats and sheep shuffle around the yard, bleating impatiently as if demanding someone hurry up with breakfast. Their breakfast, that is. A young boy carries a bucket of grain while carefully avoiding a particularly determined goat trying to investigate the contents. Livestock were absolutely essential to Viking farms. Sheep provided wool for clothing, goats gave milk, cows offered both milk and occasional meat, and pigs rooted around happily eating scraps. Without animals, surviving northern winters would have been extremely difficult, which is exactly why, during the colder months, some of these animals came inside the longhouse with you. Yes, the cosy sleeping arrangement from last night wasn't a one-time experience. Historians studying Viking farm layouts have found that many longhouses included a small partitioned section at one end specifically for animals during harsh weather. The warmth produced by livestock also helped heat the building, a kind of early biological radiator system. Efficient, though slightly fragrant. You step aside as 2 sheep wander past the doorway and back inside the hall. Apparently they know the place better than you do. Nearby, a woman carries a wooden pail toward a small fenced area where a cow waits patiently. Milking begins early in the day, since fresh milk spoils quickly without refrigeration. You watch the process quietly. The cow seems calm, used to the daily routine. The rhythmic sound of milk hitting the wooden bucket is oddly soothing, like a slow percussion instrument keeping time with the morning. Fresh milk will soon become butter, cheese, or skyr back in the longhouse kitchen. Nothing is wasted here. Another man approaches the goat pen holding a small hand knife and a bundle of herbs. At first you wonder what he's doing, but he simply kneels to trim a tangled patch of wool from one goat's side. Animal care was constant work. Healthy livestock meant food, clothing, and trade goods. You notice several sheep wearing faint marks of coloured dye along their wool. These marks help identify which animals belong to which farm if they wander across shared grazing lands. Practical and surprisingly organised. One quirky detail historians have uncovered is that Viking farmers sometimes gave animals names, especially cows and working horses. Some Old Norse sagas even mention specific livestock by name, suggesting people formed genuine attachments to them. Which might explain why the goat from last night keeps staring at you like you owe it something. Back inside the longhouse, a few animals remain near the far end where a small fenced section separates them from the main living area. Straw covers the floor there, and a wooden trough holds water. You lean against a post and watch as someone refills the trough using a bucket from the well. The animals settle comfortably, clearly familiar with the routine. Historians still argue about exactly how many animals stayed inside longhouses during winter. Some researchers believe only the most valuable livestock were sheltered indoors, while others think larger sections of the building were sometimes shared with animals. Either way, the arrangement was practical. In the cold Scandinavian climate, keeping animals close could mean the difference between survival and disaster. You hear the rhythmic thud of an axe outside and step toward the doorway again. A man is splitting firewood beside a stack of logs, each swing sending sharp cracks echoing across the yard. Firewood is life here. Without a constant supply, the hearth would fade, and the longhouse would quickly grow cold. Nearby, another person repairs a wooden fence post that winter winds apparently knocked loose. Maintenance work never really ends on a Viking farm. Everything requires attention. Everything requires hands. You glance around the small cluster of buildings again. The longhouse stands at the centre like a sturdy wooden spine, surrounded by barns, storage sheds, and workspaces. Each structure supports the others. The entire farm functions as one living system, and animals are a major part of that system. The goat nudges your leg again, clearly hoping for food. You pat its head cautiously. It seems satisfied with that. Soon the morning chores begin spreading people across the fields and shoreline. Some head toward fishing boats pulled up along the coast. Others walk toward grazing lands carrying tools and rope. The longhouse door remains open behind you, warm firelight still glowing faintly inside. Animals shuffle around your feet, birds circle above the fields, and the Viking farm hums steadily with quiet life. It may not be glamorous, but here, among goats, sheep, cows, and the comforting smell of wood smoke drifting from the hall, it's easy to see how the longhouse truly serves as the heart of everything. Even the animals seem to know it. By the time the morning chores outside settle into a steady rhythm, activity inside the longhouse has shifted again. The hearth still burns steadily in the centre, but now much of the work happening around it has to do with something Vikings constantly needed. Clothing. Warm clothing. Durable clothing. And lots of it. You step back inside and notice a small group gathered along one of the raised platforms. Bundles of wool sit piled beside them like fluffy grey clouds waiting for their next transformation. One woman holds a wooden spindle, twisting fibres into thread with practiced ease. The spindle spins gently in the air, drawing out a thin line of wool that becomes stronger as it twists. The motion is hypnotic. Pull, twist, spin. Pull, twist, spin. Wool production was a massive part of Viking household life. Sheep provided the raw material, but turning that wool into usable clothing required hours, sometimes days, of careful work. First the wool had to be cleaned, then combed or carded into soft fibres, then spun into thread. Only after that could weaving begin. You crouch nearby and watch as another woman works a set of wooden combs through a bundle of wool, straightening the fibres before they're spun. The combs click softly together, releasing tiny wisps that float briefly in the warm air. The smell of wool mixes with the scent of smoke from the hearth. Oddly comforting. Historians know that Viking women were highly skilled textile producers. In fact, textiles were so valuable that woven cloth itself sometimes functioned almost like currency in trade. A well-made length of wool cloth could be worth quite a lot. You glance across the hall and notice a tall wooden frame leaning against the wall. A loom. The loom looks simple at first, just wooden beams and hanging threads, but it represents one of the most important tools in the entire household. Viking looms were often upright warp-weighted looms, meaning the threads hung vertically with small clay weights keeping them taut. One of the women begins threading new yarn through the loom carefully. Weaving cloth required patience and concentration. Thread by thread, row by row, the fabric slowly appeared. Historians still argue about how much of this work was done daily versus seasonally, but archaeological discoveries suggest that textile production was nearly constant in many Viking homes. After all, clothing wore out quickly when people worked outdoors year-round. You pick up a small piece of finished cloth resting nearby. It's thick, strong, surprisingly soft. Most Viking clothing was made from wool because it held warmth even when damp, a very useful trait in northern climates where rain and snow were common. Linen, made from flax plants, was also used, especially for lighter garments worn closer to the skin. And despite popular imagination, Viking clothing could actually be quite colourful. Natural dyes made from plants, berries, and minerals produce shades of blue, red, yellow, and green. Archaeologists have even found traces of bright dyes preserved in Viking textile fragments. So the typical Viking wardrobe wasn't just grey and brown, it could be surprisingly vibrant. One quirky historical tidbit: some Viking graves have revealed extremely fine silk threads woven into clothing, imported all the way from Asia through vast trade networks stretching across Europe and the Middle East, which means that occasionally someone sitting in a smoky northern longhouse might be wearing fabric that travelled thousands of kilometres before reaching them. Trade connected the Viking world in ways many people don't expect. You glance toward the doorway where a small pile of worn garments sits waiting for repair. Another woman sits nearby with a bone needle, carefully stitching a torn sleeve back together. Needles made from bone, antler, or metal were common sewing tools. Clothing was repaired again and again until it simply couldn't be saved anymore. Nothing wasted. The young girl watches the sewing closely, clearly learning the craft herself. Skills like spinning and weaving were taught early, passed down from one generation to the next. The quiet concentration inside the longhouse contrasts with the busier sounds drifting in from outside. You can hear distant chopping of wood, goats bleating again, someone hammering something wooden near the barns. But inside the hall, the rhythm of textile work continues peacefully. Spin, weave, stitch, repeat. Historians sometimes note that textile production in Viking societies was so important that it likely consumed a huge portion of household labour, possibly more than farming during certain seasons. In other words, the clothes you wear in this world represent hundreds of hours of quiet craftsmanship. You lean back against one of the wooden posts and watch the loom slowly come to life. Row by row, the cloth grows longer as the threads tighten into neat patterns. The hearth crackles gently beside you. Wool fibres drift lazily through the smoky air, and the longhouse fills with the quiet sounds of spinning, weaving, and careful hands shaping warmth from simple sheep's wool. Out in the wider Viking world, ships may be sailing and warriors may be chasing glory. But here inside the longhouse, life is being stitched together one thread at a time. The steady rhythm of spinning and weaving continues through the morning, but you soon notice that not everyone inside the longhouse is focused on work. Some of the smallest members of the household are busy with something equally important: learning how to survive. A pair of children sit near the hearth carving small sticks with careful concentration. Their knives are small, more like sharp utility tools than weapons, but they handle them with surprising confidence. One of the boys is trying to carve what appears to be a tiny wooden boat. The result currently looks more like a floating potato, but the effort is impressive. In Viking households, children learned practical skills very early. By the time they reached their early teens, many were already helping with farming, fishing, cooking, weaving, or animal care. There wasn't really such a thing as a long carefree childhood. Life required preparation. You sit nearby and watch as an older man crouches beside the children, gently adjusting the boy's grip on the knife. He demonstrates a smoother carving motion, shaving thin curls of wood that fall to the floor like tiny spirals. The boy nods seriously and tries again. This time the little boat actually begins to resemble, well, a slightly better potato boat. Progress. Across the hall, two girls help sort bundles of wool that were combed earlier. They're separating the fibres into neat piles while quietly chatting about something that occasionally causes giggles. Learning through participation was the Viking version of school. Instead of desks and chalkboards, knowledge passed through observation and repetition. Watch how it's done, try it yourself, improve little by little. One historical fact we know from archaeological finds is that toys did exist in the Viking world. Small wooden animals, miniature boats, and carved dolls have been discovered in settlements and graves. So children here did play, just usually with objects that also helped them practice adult skills. A small wooden ball rolls across the floor suddenly, followed by two boys chasing after it. The ball is made of tightly wrapped cloth rather than leather, but it bounces well enough for their purposes. Someone near the hearth gives them a quiet warning look before they knock over a cooking pot. The boys quickly lower their volume. You notice an older woman sitting along the wall telling a story to a small group of children who have gathered around her. Her voice rises and falls gently as she speaks in Old Norse. Even though you don't catch every word, the tone is clear enough. This is a story that has been told many times before. Viking storytelling was a huge part of cultural life. Before written sagas existed, stories were passed orally through generations. Tales of gods like Odin and Thor, heroic warriors, clever tricksters, and distant voyages across unknown seas. Historians still debate how accurately later written sagas reflect these earlier oral traditions, but there's little doubt that storytelling helped preserve history, values, and cultural identity. You catch a few familiar names drifting through the story. Thor, Loki, a giant somewhere causing trouble. The children listen wide-eyed, clearly captivated. One quirky detail about Viking childhood is that boys sometimes received small training weapons made from wood, tiny spears or swords, to practice combat skills safely, which explains why a young boy across the room is currently swinging a wooden stick dramatically while making quiet battle noises. His imaginary enemy appears to be a particularly dangerous chair leg. Another child joins him with a smaller stick, and soon a slow-motion duel unfolds beside the hearth. Someone eventually steps in before the chair leg loses the battle. You lean back against the wooden wall and watch the scene unfold. Children learning, adults working, stories flowing quietly through the hall. The Longhouse feels like a living classroom where everyone absorbs knowledge simply by being present. One girl carefully watches the loom, where cloth is still growing row by row. She asks a question, and the woman weaving pauses to explain how the threads interlock. Patient teaching. No lectures required. Historians sometimes wonder how literacy developed in Viking societies, since runic writing existed but was not widely used for everyday records. Most knowledge, farming techniques, navigation skills, craft methods, was likely taught verbally or through hands-on experience. You notice the boy with the wooden boat returning proudly to show his progress. The boat now actually resembles a longship, if you squint slightly. The older man nods approvingly and suggests carving a small mast next. Encouragement works wonders. Outside the Longhouse door, the sounds of farm life continue drifting in. Axes chopping wood, animals shifting in their pens, distant voices calling across fields. Inside, the next generation of Vikings continues learning how to take part in that world. Through carving sticks, sorting wool, listening to stories, practicing with wooden swords, it's all preparation. Because one day, the children sitting here will grow into the farmers, sailors, storytellers, and builders who keep the Longhouse alive. And as the story by the hearth reaches a dramatic moment involving a thunder god and a very unlucky frost giant, you realise that learning here doesn't feel like work at all. It feels like growing into the rhythm of the Viking world itself. By midday, the Longhouse has settled into a calmer rhythm again. The children drift back towards small chores or quiet games. The weaving continues along one wall, and the hearth burns steadily at the centre of everything. Outside, the wind has softened, and faint sunlight spills through the doorway whenever someone steps in or out. You're sitting near the fire, absently watching someone shape a piece of wood with a small knife, when a voice calls from outside. Not loudly, just enough to catch attention. A few people glance toward the door. The man carving wood pauses and tilts his head slightly, listening. Then the door creaks open. A traveller steps inside. He carries a heavy cloak dusted with road dirt and sea salt, and his boots show the wear of someone who has walked a long way. Behind him, the cold air follows briefly into the hall before the door closes again. The warmth of the hearth wraps around him almost immediately. Visitors weren't unusual in Viking settlements. Farms and small villages were connected by paths, waterways, and trade routes that stretched across Scandinavia and far beyond. Travellers, merchants, fishermen, messengers, wandering craftsmen, often stopped at farms seeking shelter or food, and hospitality was taken seriously. In Norse culture, offering shelter to travellers was not just polite, it was expected. One of the most famous sayings from the Havamal, a collection of Old Norse wisdom poetry, roughly advises that a guest should always be welcomed with warmth, food, and a place by the fire. You watch as someone gestures toward the hearth, inviting the traveller closer. A bowl is quickly filled with stew left warming near the flames. Another person hands him a wooden cup. Within minutes, the stranger is sitting beside the fire, thawing his hands and eating gratefully. Travelling across the Viking world was rarely easy. Roads were rough, weather unpredictable, and distances often long. Even experienced travellers depended on the kindness of households along the way. You notice people casually studying the visitor, while pretending not to stare. Everyone is curious. Where did he come from? What news does he carry? The traveller swallows a spoonful of stew before speaking quietly with the household leader near the high seat. Their conversation is low, but certain words drift through the hall. A nearby coastal village. Fishing catches improving this year. A merchant ship arriving from the south. Trade was a major part of Viking society, and travellers often carried news of markets, goods, and opportunities across regions. Archaeologists have discovered Viking trade goods from astonishing distances. Silver coins from the Islamic world, silk from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, and glass beads from the Middle East. The Viking world was far more connected than many people imagine. Historians still argue about how frequently ordinary farmers encountered long-distance traders. Some believe remote farms rarely saw them, while others think travelling merchants passed through rural areas more often than we assume. But even occasional visits would bring exciting stories. The traveller gestures with his spoon as he speaks, describing something that makes several listeners lean closer. You catch a phrase about a storm at sea. Apparently a ship had trouble navigating rough waters near the coast last week. The crew managed to reach harbour safely, though not without losing a small cargo crate. The room hums with quiet interest. Stories from outside the farm break the rhythm of everyday chores. You notice one of the children slowly inching closer to the traveller, pretending to poke the fire while clearly listening to every word. Another quirky detail. Vikings loved storytelling about travel and adventure, especially tales involving storms, strange lands, or unusual creatures spotted during voyages. The more dramatic the story, the better. The traveller eventually laughs softly and shrugs as if to admit that maybe the storm grew slightly bigger in his telling. Story exaggeration is apparently timeless. Someone offers him a second bowl of stew. Another person hangs his damp cloak near the hearth to dry. Hospitality continues quietly without ceremony. In return, the traveller begins sharing news from farther away, mentioning a seasonal gathering planned in a larger settlement not too far from here. Such gatherings often included markets, feasts, games, and legal assemblies where disputes could be settled. These events were important moments in Viking communities, bringing scattered farms together. You lean back against the wooden post and listen as the conversation flows. News travels slowly in this world, but when it arrives, it spreads through halls like warm firelight. Outside the Longhouse, daily work continues. Inside, the visitors' stories stretch the imagination beyond nearby fields and fishing boats, ships crossing cold seas, markets filled with traders from distant lands, storm clouds rolling across open water. For a little while, the Longhouse feels connected to a much larger Viking world, and as the traveller warms himself by the hearth, finishing the last of his stew, it becomes clear that the Longhouse isn't just a home. It's also a small crossroads where stories, people, and distant horizons occasionally meet. The traveller's stories eventually soften into quieter conversation, and the Longhouse settles back into its steady afternoon rhythm. But as you glance toward the far wall again, something becomes clearer that you hadn't fully noticed earlier. Not every seat in the hall is equal. The benches along the sides look similar at first glance. Simple wood, layered furs, the occasional carved detail worn smooth by years of use. But one area stands out just slightly from the rest. Near the middle of the wall sits a larger chair-like structure, framed by thicker wooden posts and decorated with subtle carvings. That's the high seat, the place reserved for the household's leader. You watch as the man who spoke with the traveller earlier returns to that spot and sits down, resting his arms comfortably along the carved sides. It's not a throne in the dramatic sense, no gold, no towering backrest, but its position makes it important. From here he can see the entire longhouse, the hearth, the doorway, the sleeping benches, everyone inside. In Viking society, the leader of a household, often called a chieftain or simply the head of the family, carried responsibility for the farm's survival and the people living there. That included making decisions about farming, trade, disputes and protection. Historians know that many Viking farms operated under a loose social hierarchy. Wealthier landowners held more influence, while workers, servants and thralls formed the lower levels of the household structure. But daily life still involved cooperation. Everyone depended on the longhouse functioning smoothly. You notice the traveller speaking again, this time addressing the man in the high seat more directly. Their conversation seems practical, something about weather conditions near the coast and a possible trading opportunity if fishing remained strong this season. Decisions often began with discussions like this, not dramatic speeches, just calm conversation near the fire. One historical fact scholars point out is that Viking leaders often held gatherings called things, assemblies where free men met to discuss laws, settle disputes, and vote on community matters. These meetings formed an early kind of democratic process within Norse societies. Historians still argue about exactly how much authority individual chieftains held. Some believe they governed quite firmly, while others suggest their power depended heavily on maintaining the support and loyalty of their followers. Leadership in this world required trust as much as strength. You glance again at the carved posts framing the high seat. Each post features simple knot patterns and animal shapes worked into the wood. The carvings aren't flashy, but they show careful craftsmanship. Decoration like this often held symbolic meaning. Some scholars believe carvings around high seats might have represented protective spirits, or animals connected to Norse mythology. Though historians still debate exactly how much symbolism was intentional versus decorative tradition. Across the hall, two farm workers sit closer to the entrance sharpening tools. They speak quietly, occasionally glancing toward the high seat when the traveller mentions something interesting. The layout of the longhouse naturally reinforces this subtle hierarchy. Important guests sit closer to the leader. Workers often gather nearer the doorway. Children drift wherever there's space. No formal rules seem written down, but everyone understands the arrangement. You notice the traveller eventually stand and stretch his legs before walking closer to the hearth again. Someone hands him a cup of warm drink, possibly diluted ale or herbal tea. Hospitality continues, but the leader's conversation with him seems finished for now. Another person approaches the high seat briefly to ask a question about repairing a fence near the pasture. The leader listens, nods, and gives a short answer. Problem solved. Daily decisions often look exactly like this. No grand meetings required, just quick discussions between people who trust each other's judgment. One quirky historical detail about Viking leadership is that chieftains often hosted large feasts to maintain loyalty among their followers. Providing food, drink and entertainment strengthened social bonds and reinforced the leader's reputation for generosity. In other words, throwing a good party was actually an important political skill. You imagine this longhouse during one of those gatherings, the benches packed with visitors, the hearth blazing brighter than usual, music, laughter, storytelling echoing through the rafters. But today the hall remains calm. Work continues. The traveller rests. The leader sits quietly in the high seat, occasionally watching the activity around the room like a captain observing the crew of a steady ship. Outside, clouds drift slowly across the pale afternoon sky. Inside, the longhouse carries on with its familiar rhythm, a place where authority exists, but life still moves through shared work and quiet cooperation. And from the high seat beside the fire, the entire wooden world of the longhouse unfolds in view. As the afternoon light slowly begins to soften, the pace inside the longhouse shifts again. The heavier work gradually winds down. Tools are set aside, spinning slows, and the loom rests for the moment with its unfinished cloth hanging patiently in place. Outside, the sky has turned a gentle pale gold, hinting that evening isn't too far away. Inside the hall, people drift back toward the hearth. Even though the fire has been burning all day, someone adds fresh logs anyway. The flames leap higher for a moment, sending warm light dancing across the rafters. Evenings in a Viking longhouse weren't silent, but they were different from daytime. You settle near the fire again, noticing a small wooden board placed on the floor between two men. On the board sit several small carved pieces, smooth stones and tiny wooden markers arranged in neat rows. A game. Board games were surprisingly popular in the Viking world. One of the most famous was Nefertafel, sometimes called the Viking chess. It involved a king piece trying to escape while opponents attempted to capture him. The rules were slightly different from modern chess, but the strategy could be just as intense. You watch as one player moves a piece carefully across the board. His opponent studies the move for several seconds before sliding one of his own markers forward. No rush, no loud cheering, just quiet concentration beside the fire. Historians know these games existed because archaeologists have discovered game boards and pieces in Viking graves and settlements across Scandinavia. Some pieces were simple stones, while others were beautifully carved from bone or antler. Even warriors needed something relaxing to do during long evenings. Nearby, someone lifts a small wooden harp-like instrument, a lyre. The musician plucks a few gentle notes, testing the strings before settling into a slow melody. The sound is soft and warm, blending naturally with the crackle of the hearth. Music in Viking society wasn't loud spectacle the way modern concerts are. It was intimate, personal, often just one person playing while others listened quietly. You lean back against one of the thick support posts and close your eyes for a moment, letting the music drift through the hall. The steady rhythm of the melody pairs nicely with the fire's quiet popping. Across the room, the older woman from earlier begins telling another story. This one sounds different from the dramatic saga about Thor. The tone is gentler, perhaps a story about clever travellers or ancient kings. Storytelling filled the long winter evenings when daylight vanished early. Without books or screens, stories became the entertainment, the history lesson, and the cultural memory of the community all at once. Historians still argue how accurately these stories preserved real historical events. Over generations, details often changed, grew larger, or gained magical elements. But the core ideas remained: courage, cleverness, honour, community. You glance back toward the board game where the players are now deep in strategy. One of them suddenly smiles as he captures an important piece. His opponent groans quietly. The surrounding listeners chuckle. Friendly rivalry. A small child nearby tries to copy the lyre player by plucking a loose string on another instrument resting against the wall. The sound comes out as a slightly confused twang. The musician glances over, grins, and gently adjusts the child's fingers on the strings. A better note follows. Learning continues even during relaxation. One quirky historical tidbit researchers have discovered is that Vikings also enjoyed riddles and word games. Some Norse poems included riddles meant to challenge listeners' cleverness, which means evenings might occasionally involve someone asking tricky questions like, "What walks without feet and speaks without a mouth?" and everyone arguing about the answer until someone finally guesses correctly. The hearth glows brighter as another log settles into the flames. Outside, the wind rustles softly through the fields. Inside, the longhouse fills with quiet life. Music, games, stories, laughter low enough not to disturb anyone resting on the sleeping platforms. This is how many Viking evenings likely passed. Calm, communal, and gently entertaining after a long day of work. Not every night involved grand feasts or dramatic sagas. Sometimes it was simply people gathering beside the fire to unwind. Historians often remind us that the Viking Age wasn't just a time of raids and exploration. Most people spent their lives farming, crafting, raising families and sharing ordinary evenings like this one. And honestly, those quiet evenings probably mattered far more than the battles. You stretch your legs toward the warmth of the hearth again. The board game continues, the lyre hums softly. Another story unfolds across the hall, and slowly as darkness begins creeping across the fields outside, the longhouse prepares for another peaceful night wrapped in firelight and familiar voices. By the time darkness fully settles outside, the longhouse feels like a warm island of light surrounded by a quiet sea of night. The wind has returned. You can hear it now more clearly than before, brushing across the roof and whispering along the wooden walls. The building responds with the occasional creak of timber beams shifting gently under pressure. It's not alarming, just the sound of a structure doing exactly what it was built to do. You glance toward the doorway where someone has pushed the heavy wooden plank door firmly into place. A thick leather strap secures it against sudden gusts. Outside, the world might be growing colder and darker, but inside the hall the hearth burns steadily. Someone tosses another log into the flames. It lands with a sharp crack and a burst of sparks that swirl upward toward the smoky rafters. Storms were a regular part of life in northern Europe, especially during the colder months. Winter winds could sweep down from the mountains or across open seas with surprising force, which is exactly why Viking longhouses were designed the way they were: long, low, and sturdy. Archaeological studies of longhouse foundations show that builders often dug shallow trenches along the walls before setting thick wooden posts into the ground. The roof beams then connected across the top like the ribs of a massive wooden animal. The result was a flexible but strong structure capable of handling heavy snow, rain, and powerful winds. You run your hand along one of the central support posts again. It barely vibrates even as the wind pushes against the roof outside. Historians still argue whether longhouses required frequent rebuilding due to weather damage, or whether some structures lasted several generations with proper maintenance. Evidence suggests both happened depending on location and materials, but either way, constant repairs were simply part of life. A man near the doorway suddenly stands and walks toward a small wooden bucket placed under the edge of the roof beam. Drip, drip. A thin trickle of water is falling into it. Apparently the roof has a small leak. He adjusts the bucket slightly with a shrug, clearly treating the situation as normal. Thatch roofs made from straw, reeds, or turf were excellent insulation, but they occasionally allowed rain to sneak through. A well-placed bucket solved the problem. One quirky detail historians sometimes mention is that Viking houses required regular rethatching, adding fresh layers of straw to keep the roof weatherproof. Without maintenance, even the strongest roof would slowly weaken under years of storms. You sit back down beside the hearth as the wind picks up another notch outside. The sound rolls across the roof like distant ocean waves. Inside, though, the longhouse feels solid and calm. The fire crackles. People continue their quiet evening activities. Someone adds more wool to the spinning spindle. Another person carefully sharpens a small blade. A few children are already drifting towards sleep on the benches along the wall. Storms might rage outside, but inside the hall, life carries on almost unchanged. You glance toward the animal section at the far end where the sheep and goats have settled into straw beds. One of them shifts sleepily, shaking its ears as the wind rattles the outer wall. Even the animals seem to trust the building. A woman near the hearth lifts a kettle and pours warm herbal drink into small wooden cups. The steam curls gently upward, carrying a faint smell of mint or wild thyme. Warm drinks like this helped people relax before sleep. You accept a cup and hold it close, letting the heat warm your hands. Outside, the wind suddenly slams against the door with a loud thump. Several people glance up instinctively, but the door holds. The beam across the frame doesn't even budge. Moments later, the hall settles back into its steady rhythm. Storm endured. Another interesting historical note. Viking settlers who moved to places like Iceland often built houses partially dug into the earth. These semi-subterranean structures used thick turf walls to block wind and trap warmth even more effectively. Living partly underground might sound strange, but it worked extremely well in harsh climates. You sip the herbal drink slowly. The warmth spreads through your chest, matching the glow from the hearth nearby. The wind continues singing its restless song outside, but here, inside the longhouse, the atmosphere remains steady and safe. Timber beams hold firm. Firelight flickers. People relax beneath thick wool blankets. The building itself almost feels alive, breathing slowly through the roof vents, sheltering everyone within its wooden ribs. Storms will come and go, rain will fall, snow will pile against the walls in winter, but tonight the longhouse stands strong. And as the wind hums across the dark northern landscape beyond the door, the warm heart of the hall keeps glowing quietly against the storm. As the wind outside slowly fades into a softer whisper, the longhouse settles into the quieter hours of evening. The hearth glows low and steady now, its flames smaller, but still warm enough to fill the hall with a gentle orange light. Most of the day's work is finished. People move more slowly, voices grow softer, and in the calm between conversation and sleep, you begin to notice something else woven quietly into everyday life here. Belief. Not loud ceremonies, not dramatic rituals, just small moments. A woman near the hearth places a tiny piece of bread into the fire before eating her own meal. She does it casually, almost automatically, as though it's simply part of the routine, a small offering. In the Viking world, religion wasn't always grand temples or huge sacrifices. Many beliefs were woven into simple daily habits, tiny gestures meant to show respect to unseen forces. The Norse believed their world was filled with gods, spirits, and hidden powers. Odin, the wandering god of wisdom. Thor, the Thunderbringer protecting humanity from giants. Freya, goddess of love and magic. But alongside these famous figures, there were also quieter beliefs about household spirits and land spirits. Some Vikings believed certain places, fields, forests, rivers, were watched over by invisible guardians, so offering a bit of food or drink was a way of staying on good terms with them. You notice the traveller from earlier quietly touching a small pendant hanging around his neck before settling down to rest. In the flickering firelight you recognise the shape, a tiny hammer, a Mjolnir pendant, representing Thor's hammer. Archaeologists have discovered hundreds of these small hammer-shaped amulets in Viking graves and settlements. People likely wore them for protection or as symbols of faith. Historians still debate whether these pendants became especially popular during the later Viking Age, as Norse beliefs encountered the spread of Christianity across Europe. But here inside the Longhouse, the hammer simply looks like a familiar part of everyday life. Nearby, the older storyteller speaks quietly with a few listeners about something more mysterious, whispering a tale about Landvetir, the protective spirits believed to guard certain landscapes. According to Old Norse tradition, ships approaching Iceland were once required to remove dragon head carvings from their prows so they wouldn't frighten the land spirits. Even travellers respected the unseen. You lean closer to the hearth again, feeling its warmth against your legs. The flames flicker gently across the carved wooden posts and the hanging bundles of herbs overhead. It's easy to imagine how belief grows in a place like this, when storms rage outside, when dark winters stretch for months, when survival depends on both skill and luck. People naturally look for meaning in the world around them. One quirky historical tidbit. Archaeologists have found small carved figurines in Viking homes that may have represented gods or protective spirits, though scholars still debate their exact purpose. Some might have been religious objects, others could simply have been decorations or toys. The truth is often hard to separate from legend. You watch as someone quietly sprinkles a few dried herbs into the hearth fire. The herbs crackle briefly and release a soft, fragrant smoke that drifts toward the roof beams. Perhaps it's for the pleasant smell, perhaps something more. Historians still argue about how formal Viking religious practices were inside ordinary homes. Large sacrifices and ceremonies certainly happened at temples and sacred sites, but daily life likely included many small personal rituals like these. Nothing dramatic, just gestures of respect. The hall grows quieter as more people settle onto the sleeping platforms. The board game from earlier has been packed away. The lyre rests against the wall again. Even the animals in the far corner have curled into sleep, their breathing slow and steady. Outside, the wind has nearly disappeared. Only a faint rustle remains in the darkness beyond the door. You glance once more toward the small offering still glowing faintly in the fire, bread turning slowly into ash, a quiet thank you to whatever forces might be listening. The Viking world may be filled with gods, spirits, and ancient myths, but inside the Longhouse those beliefs live gently beside everyday life. No thunderbolts required, just a warm hearth, a handful of herbs, and a small piece of bread offered to the flames before the night grows deeper. The night grows deeper, and the Longhouse gradually returns to the quiet rhythm you remember from yesterday evening. The hearth burns low now, its flames shrinking into a gentle glow of red and gold embers. Someone nearby nudges a final piece of wood into place, not enough to brighten the hall too much, just enough to keep the warmth alive through the night. People settle into their sleeping spaces one by one. Blankets unfold. Furs shift softly against the wooden platforms. The familiar creak of benches echoes briefly as everyone finds their comfortable position again. You return to the same sleeping spot from the night before, beside the wall where the timber beams hold the roof steady above your head. The sheepskin blanket still feels thick and warm as you pull it across your shoulders. Across the hall, the traveller has claimed a place not far from the hearth. The goat from earlier has also returned. Apparently this is its favourite sleeping area. You're beginning to suspect the goat thinks it owns the Longhouse. The hall slowly quiets. One child whispers a final question to a parent before drifting off. Someone near the animal section adjusts a small straw pile so the sheep settle more comfortably. Even the wind outside seems to have grown tired. All that remains now is the steady breathing of people resting after a long day, and the quiet crackle of the hearth. You stare upward at the dark wooden beams crossing the ceiling. In the dim light you can see faint patterns carved into some of them. Simple shapes, knots, perhaps even animals worn smooth by time. This building has likely stood here for many years, maybe even decades. Generations might have slept beneath these same beams, listening to the same fire and the same distant wind moving across the northern fields. Archaeologists studying Viking settlements have found evidence that some longhouses were rebuilt repeatedly on the same spot. When old structures weakened, new ones rose over their foundations. The location remained constant even as the buildings changed. Historians still argue whether families preferred rebuilding in familiar places for practical reasons, or because they felt spiritually connected to the land their ancestors had lived on. Perhaps a little of both. You shift slightly under the blanket, feeling the warmth from the hearth reach your side of the room again. The longhouse has that comforting quality now, like a large wooden shelter breathing quietly through the night. It's not silent. Wood creaks occasionally, an ember pops. Somewhere a goat sighs in its sleep. But these sounds are gentle, familiar, the kind of background rhythm that slowly lulls the mind toward rest. Outside these walls lies the vast Viking world, cold seas, rugged forests, distant trade routes stretching across continents. Ships will sail again tomorrow. Fields will need tending. Animals will wander the pastures. Stories will continue around the hearth. But for now, the longhouse simply rests. The traveller's journey pauses. The children dream. The loom waits patiently for morning, and the fire glows softly like the heart of the hall itself. You pull the blanket a little closer, and feel your body relax into the warmth of the wooden platform. The scent of smoke, wool, and dried herbs drifts gently through the air. Strangely enough, it's comforting now. After spending a full day inside the longhouse, watching its people work, eat, talk, laugh, and prepare for rest, you begin to understand something simple but important. This place isn't just a building. It's a small world, a place where families live through long winters and short summers, where stories pass between generations, where the hearth never truly goes out. And as the embers dim further into a quiet glow, your eyes grow heavier. The last voices fade. The longhouse breathes slowly beneath its heavy roof. And somewhere beyond the wooden door, the northern night stretches peacefully across fields and distant hills. Wind down, now the hall is almost completely still. The fire has softened into quiet embers that pulse gently in the darkness, like slow heartbeats beneath the ash. The light they cast is soft and warm, barely reaching the edges of the longhouse where shadows rest quietly against the walls. You breathe slowly. The warmth from the hearth spreads across the floorboards and up through the wooden benches, wrapping the room in a calm that feels safe and steady. Outside, the wind has faded to nothing more than a faint whisper moving through the distant grass. Inside, everyone sleeps. The traveller, the children, the workers who will wake before sunrise again. Even the animals have settled into deep, peaceful rest. The longhouse itself seems to drift into sleep with them, its timber beams holding the roof like gentle arms around the quiet hall. The fire will last through the night. In the morning someone will stir the embers, flames will rise again, and life will begin once more around the hearth. But for now, the Viking world is calm, soft, still. So let the warmth of the longhouse carry you the rest of the way into sleep, just as it has carried countless travellers and families through long northern nights. And as the last embers glow quietly in the dark, you can rest knowing the hall stands strong around you, safe, warm, and waiting for morning.